Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium for the 13th of November. We're really pleased to have you with us today. I want to begin by reading the Land Acknowledgement, and then I'll talk just briefly about the colloquium series before introducing our speaker today. Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations, historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. Again, thanks so much for taking an hour out of your day to spend with us. The University Interdisciplinary Colloquium, for those of you who might be new to it, is a forum that is organized by the MSU Center for Interdisciplinarity and sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters. It exists to highlight the innovative and important interdisciplinary work that involves the arts and the humanities at Michigan State. Interdisciplinarity, as many of you know, is often code for well-funded complex science when it comes to research universities. That's typically, or at least not uncommonly, the referent for the term when it's used. But some of the best and most influential interdisciplinary work reflects an appreciation for aesthetic and humanistic dimensions of human experience, broadly construed. The reality is that for many of the complex problems that motivate interdisciplinary responses, what makes them complex is that there are humans at their center, right? Both as causes and effects. And artists and humanists are in an especially good position to appreciate those dimensions of complex problems. The UIC is an attempt to acknowledge and amplify interdisciplinary contributions that feature aesthetic and humanistic elements. We meet every other week during the fall and the spring semesters. And this year, at least the fall slate, probably at this point, the spring slate as well, will be on Zoom. So, the next session will be in 2 weeks. So on December 4th at this time, Dr. April Baker-Bell, who is Associate Professor of Language Literacy and English Education in the Department of English and also the Department of African American and African Studies, will be with us to deliver a talk entitled, "We Need a Teacher, Researcher, Activist, an Interdisciplinary Approach to Anti-Racist Medical Education." So that's in 2 weeks on the 4th, or actually, I guess 3 weeks, sorry, on the 4th of December, my bad. Yeah, that's 3 weeks away. Today, we're super thrilled to have with us Dr. Dylan Miner. Dylan was scheduled to be a participant in the spring before everything went off the rails. And he has, fortunately for us, remained willing to stay part of the series, and we rescheduled his talk to today. Dr. Miner is an artist, activist, and scholar. He is a director of American Indian and Indigenous Studies, as well as professor in the Residential College in the Arts and Humanities at Michigan State University. He holds a PhD in art history from the University of New Mexico and is a founding member of the Just Seeds Artist Collective. His scholarly book, Creating Aztlan, Chicano Art, Indigenous Sovereignty, and Lowriding Across Turtle Island, was published by the University of Arizona Press. He has exhibited and published extensively, including a number of small artist books, such as Anakabujagan, Wawashkeshi, a booklet on Métis and Anishinaabe beadwork, a notebook for learners of Ojibwe and Odawa, among others. In 2020, Miner's artwork was included in the Abedakwane Continuous Fire at the National Gallery of Canada and the Contemporary Native Art Biennial in Montreal. Miner descends from the historic Georgian Bay Metis community, one of 7 recognized Section 35 rights-bearing Métis communities in Ontario, and is a registered citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. Today, Dr. Miner is with us to deliver a talk entitled Art as Research, Research for Art. Dr. Miner.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, C4I, for the invitation and for continuing the invitation after the beginning of the pandemic last spring and extending that to this semester. And thanks for all of you for being here and kind of watching the presentation in the webinar style as we struggle to understand and respond to the necessity of intellectual and academic and artistic labor in this moment of social distancing and trying to do our best to create a more better and just world. Let me begin by extending or expanding the land acknowledgement that Professor O'Rourke began with, by also acknowledging that, one, we do stand on 1819 Treaty of Saginaw territory, or the university resides on land occupied. But I'm also coming to you from that same territory. And it's important to note that the university, or that the Morrill Act, which enables the land grant university system, which of course Michigan State likes to refer to itself as, and I will put up my air quotes here, the pioneer land grant university, but that the Morrill Act was passed in 1862, which is also the year of the Homestead Act, as well as the year of the largest mass execution in the nation's history, the hanging of the Dakota 38 in Mankato, Minnesota. And I share all of this to begin my talk by recognizing and noting that the history of land grant education in this nation is one that is indelibly linked to ongoing expropriation of indigenous lands, as well as violence against indigenous peoples and Black peoples. And when we look at, there was a recent article by the scholar Phil Deloria in the New Yorker, where he talked about the relationship between some of this history and the Dred Scott decision. And I think, of course, it's imperative on us, as we understand our position within our own institutions, to also think about this and to affirm and to make sure we tell these stories. I'm going to talk, as Dr. O'Rourke noted, on art as research for art, by focusing and sharing some of my own artistic practices and some of my own artistic projects as a way of thinking through larger questions. And I think these questions are important because they're relevant to larger society, but more importantly, or just as importantly, they discuss or describe or begin to illuminate the role and oftentimes marginal role that the arts play within a research institution, such as land grant institutions like ours. Before I move into this, let me begin by setting up some of my own biography and introducing myself. Tanishikiawo, Nimayuyan, Dishinikashun Dylan, Ani Buju, Dylan Minor, Indigenous Jogenashimwin. I am, as Professor O'Rourke said, besides the artwork behind me falling down because the heater came on in my house, I am descended from the historic Georgian Bay Metis community and a registered citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. The Georgian Bay Metis community is a community that in the historic record is known as the French half-breeds. Basically, the word Métis describes mixed descent or post-contact indigenous peoples that arose here in the upper Great Lakes and into Western North America, particularly on the Canadian prairie provinces and just south of the Medicine Line in the US plains. Our community aligned ourselves with the British in the War of 1812. And because of that, we were basically, when the border was installed following the War of 1812, you can see here, our community was at a place called Drummond Island, what in Anishinaabe is known as Botagini Minis, or the place where wild rice is milled. But because our community was in alignment with the British, when the border was kind of created there in the 1820s, late 1820s, following border disputes and the creation, kind of the cementing of that border, you can see here the way that that border wraps around Drummond Island. And so our community in 1828, 1829 was forced from the island and migrated to a place on the Georgian Bay in Ontario called Benedangwisheen, or the place that the sands or the beaches change shape. Part of our history is one of affirming. We see in Upper Great Lakes Métis communities and with our relatives out on the prairies a number of attempts to actually affirm and assert Indigenous sovereignty. But what we see is both the British and the Americans, and then therefore the Canadians on the other side, refusing to acknowledge and engage with rights-bearing Métis communities in the treaty process. And so here, once our community was moved from Drummond Island in 1840 or in 1828, they petitioned the Canadian government, Indian Affairs, to receive annuities, that is annual payments like other First Nations and some Métis bands were receiving. I share this document because one, that petition was never recognized or was never responded to by the Canadian government, and those rights were therefore never done away with. But that document recognizing, or the document is archived within Indian Affairs in Canada. And as you can see here, this is the cover piece for that petition, which says, "A petition of certain half-breed Indians praying for presence." And I find that, just the way that it's recorded in the documents is important and humorous as well, because it has this idea of praying for presence. I share all of this because 2 years later, in 1842, the Canadian government, and here, of course, where we're at in Michigan State and where Michigan lies here in the Great Lakes borderlands, in tradition in Anishinaabe territory, I think these issues still play out today. 2 years after this petition was filed, basically, Thomas Gummersall Anderson, the Secretary for Indian Affairs, asserts this particular mode of excluding half-breeds from receiving presents, or basically creates a policy to disavow Métis folks from actually engaging in annual annuity or present making, as well as the treaty making process. And we'll see that later in 1850 in Sault Ste. Marie, and then subsequently following the two so-called Riel rebellions out on the plains. Of course, I'm not here to talk about this history, but this history here sets up the work that I do as a scholar and as an artist. And it's always important to situate our own biographies and our own histories as embodied individuals, as members of collectivities into the process. So fast forward to the summer of 2019, and the Métis Nation of Ontario signed a government recognition and self-government agreement with the Government of Canada, putting in place actually the final process to receive full self-determination. As an individual, much of the work I do as an artist is situated within this history, but also thinking about the ancestral cultural practices of my ancestors, both settler and Indigenous. And particularly this work, which was created by my grandfather's grandmother, which is known as an octopus bag, and they're a beaded cultural object of Métis folks throughout the Métis Nation homeland and here in the Upper Great Lakes, which were meant to hold various elements for starting fires, but also herbal and plant-based medicines. And so my practice as an artist oftentimes begins and understands and tries to respond to ongoing and long-term histories, and trying to think not about history as something that's behind us, but the very integration of histories and futures in the present moment. So in my talk today, there'll be 4 provocations that are woven throughout. One is the thinking that art is in and of itself an ontology. That is, art is a way of being. Art is an epistemology. That is, art is a way of knowing. And I think this is something that those in the humanities and particularly moving towards the social sciences, sometimes don't fully understand or fully engage with, and that is art. And I'm talking particularly about the visual arts or the history of contemporary art that goes back within a certain disciplinary, yet crosses disciplinary boundaries, but that art does not merely illustrate those knowledges and research in other fields. And we often see this when artworks become published as part of academic texts, but are seen as simply the kind of visualization of other more complex intellectual ideas that come from research. And we also see this within the workings of various university and institutional infrastructures, where I would say the arts become and are seen as, in some ways, the icing on the cake. They're the visual things that people want to take photos of and put in an outward facing way on websites, yet don't actually integrate them into the workings of the university in the same way. And so that leads to the fourth provocation that is part of my talk today, which is that artistic ways of knowing are marginalized within the university. And I think that Professor O'Rourke, in setting it up, is moving or trying to articulate C4I in ways that better centralize the arts within all of this. So what I'm going to do is I have a series of different methods or modes that I use within my research practice or within my artistic practice. And so I'll be touching on some of these and then leaving time for us to engage in conversation at the end, as best as we can engage in conversation via the webinar format, where I'm sitting here talking to myself and a blank computer screen with a green light at the top. So one of the things that is central to my work is this notion of plants or the non-human as collaborator. So oftentimes we think of, the humanities, of course, are about what makes us unique as humans. I think that something that we can or should move towards in terms of the arts is that the arts, and my practice in particular and the practice of others, are also about understanding and thinking about non-human collaborators. So this section of work that I'm showing you here emerges from the notion of Akigikendamwen, which is an Anishinaabemowin word which talks about language learned and in relationship with the land. And here, when I'm talking about the land, I'm literally talking about the earth, but I'm talking about all of those beings and all of those entities, those plants, those animals that have a relational, a kin-based relationship with the land. And so part of this thinking of collaborating with non-humans is also thinking about the way that we exist in relationship with others, with disciplines, with humans, with the other than human. This is a picture of Howard Kimawan. Howard is an elder from Wichemacong First Nation who lives in the Upper Peninsula now. Wichemacong First Nation is on the Canadian side of the border. It's on Manitoulin Island, and as part of the treaty making process was never actually ceded. And so because of that, and because of its very important history, there are lots of fluent speaking Ojibwe first language speakers and language teachers there, many of whom in the mid-19th century, sorry, mid-20th century, moved to the greater Lansing area into other urban spaces in Michigan to work in the auto industry. This is a few summers ago, harvesting bark in the Upper Peninsula. From that harvesting of bark, lots of things, lots of relationships happen. I think it's important to us to think about the relationship that exists between an individual or individuals and trees when they begin to develop synergistic relationships that understand when is the appropriate time to harvest. How can I harvest a bark in a way that won't do damage to the tree? How can I harvest roots from here, these spruce roots, pulled from the earth without actually doing damage to the tree? So part of the work of an artist, if we use that word in this context, is understanding one's relationship to a variety of beings and kin-based relationships. These are some other mostly birch bark objects that I've made here, from baskets to quill work to etchings to the one in the center is a biting where you use your teeth to incise the thin pieces of bark. And on the bottom are a push pole for harvesting wild rice, going back to this notion of Drummond Island as Botagini Minis. And one of the bays around Drummond Island has one of the older pre-colonial wild rice beds in the eastern Upper Peninsula. Another methodology that I employ in my work, and I think it's crucial to the practices of many, is what comes to me through conversations and oral histories with retired Anishinaabeg auto workers here in Lansing, where a number of years ago, two colleagues and friends of mine, Don Lyons and Allard Teeple, were speaking with elders, having tea and bannock or other baked goods on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And in those conversations with Doug DeBassague, George Roy, Alphonse Pitawanakwat, and others, was the idea that, you know, through capitalism, through urbanization, we don't visit in the same way. And that actually visiting with people, and we're in a time where visiting is much more difficult, and intentionally so, to make sure that we keep elders and those who may have compromised immune systems healthy, that visiting in and of itself can be a method or can be a research practice that is employed, not simply to be used as a way to glean knowledge or research, but that visiting in and of itself is an important practice and doesn't have to be seen as the background research that goes into the production of research, right? It is both a methodology and it is the research itself. This is a visiting session in the Northwest, in the Yukon Territory in Dawson City, as part of an exhibition I had there at the Klondike Institute of Art and Culture, where part of my practice is to utilize and transform galleries, museums, and university structures into momentary and temporary to provisional spaces where we can host gatherings and visit with one another. A very similar sort of project here in Vancouver, where the Gallery Gachet, an artist-run center in the downtown East End, which is a community that has a significant urban Indigenous population, and because of that also is known for a variety of other things. But here you can see we've created this table meant for visiting through furniture that I've made with shipping pallets that were found in the neighborhood itself. All of these plants, all of these prints that you see exhibited around here, are actually part of, going back to that collaborating with the other than human. These are prints that I make of edible and medicinal plants in the region that I'm working in, that are basically, I develop a relationship with the plant and then make a relief print of the plant that is then printed using inks that I make from berries I harvest in the region as well. So there becomes this this embodied, this engaged, this much longer relationship with the art making than simply making something that exists in and of itself as an artwork. It's a conversation, I think, circulating within many different intellectual and artistic communities, and that is whether or not the university museum, the anthropological or natural history museum, the art museum, any of these museums themselves, if and of themselves, they can actually serve as proper stewards to artworks, and thinking more intentionally from artworks that come from non-Western, from indigenous societies throughout the world. Kind of another extension of that, this is at the Stamps Gallery at U of M, where you can see this table here has been placed in the gallery with these prints on the wall. And then throughout the duration of the show, we would host teas, and then people would come in and either build or extend or continue existing and or new kin and other relationships with people. It was about creating social relationships. This is a close-up of one of those prints, and you can see here on the print itself, the inks, use inks in air quotes, but these inks are made from berries that are harvested. So they also have the seeds in them, the pulp in them. As I've been taught, the seeds hold the stories, so I don't want to remove the seeds. But also because they're natural, they start off in this vibrant color, this purple color, but over time they oxidize and change. So the artworks themselves become living entities. And I think that it becomes hard for us, particularly within a certain Western academic understanding of the world, to make sense of the fluidity that sometimes the arts operate within. Thinking about hosting workshops as a form of visiting and as a form of collaborative making. Again, also as a critique in many ways of the infrastructure of the university, we often put names of individual artists on things. We put the names of individual scholars or small teams of scholars. What would it mean to actually transform that and begin to understand culture less as objects made by individuals, but rather objects that are made collaboratively and collectively, which is, we can see here in this bike making workshop that I've hosted. I have an ongoing project called Anishna Ben Sabim Squebshkigewag, Native Kids Ride Bikes, where we'll host workshops and make lowrider bicycles and often bring in elders, fluent speaking elders and knowledge keepers. This was one of those workshops at Fort Lewis College, which is a former boarding school in Durango, Colorado, which is now a university that has a Indian tuition waiver. So Native students who are enrolled citizens of federally recognized tribes in the US can attend the university with a tuition remission. Part of all of this is also beginning to understand our slow and low relationship to territory, to land, and to history. And part of that, as Professor O'Rourke said in the introduction, I have a scholarly book called Creating Aslan, Chicano Art, Indigenous Sovereignty and Lowriding Across Turtle Island, which looks at an indigenous take on Mexican-American or Chicano art, particularly post-1968, and the way that art actually uses, and at the core of my research agenda with that text is using as a methodology the notion of lowriding, which comes to us from lowrider cars, either developed in East Los Angeles, California, or in Española, New Mexico. Both of those have vibrant and very old lowriding cultural communities. But this notion of lowriding, which uses an automobile to move slowly throughout time and space, to actually invert the pace of capitalism, is crucial to, I think, the way that I think the arts work, or particularly certain forms of the arts, because we all know that there is within the arts the possibility of celebrity, the possibility of making lots of money. But the reality is that most artists do not exist in this world of selling works within the capitalist art market of Gagosian galleries in New York or that. And so for me, my interest is actually making work that exists outside of capitalist logics. And many of these works are actually gifted away and exchanged, given away and exchanged in that capacity. So these are some bikes that I've made as part of that process, thinking through histories and collaborations. These were made in Vancouver a number of years ago, each of them in collaboration with a local artist. This one was made by the Gitxsan, or in relationship and in collaboration with the Gitxsan carver, Trevor Angus. These are 4 other bikes that were built at MOCNA, the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe, during Indian Market, which is a time where there's a vibrant American Indian art market in Santa Fe. And these were some of the youth that all Navajo or Diné folks. But these are some of the bikes that we built there. Where each of the bikes, you can see the one in the front is actually a seed saver bike. 3 of those are seed savers of corn, bean, and squash. Back there on the back, you can see a box which holds ancestral varieties of beans. On the 3rd bike there, you can see there's a pot hanging off the bat. That is actually a Clarence Cruz pot that we put on the bike. And so 3 of the bikes are in reference to that. As an artist and also as somebody who writes, I think critically, and as you can see to this point, that history is a form of material, and that material also becomes a form. So there's relationship to understanding history as materiality and that materiality as form. This is from an exhibition at the Grand Rapids Art Museum called "Water is Sacred, Trees Are Relatives." Which had a number of cyanotypes, which is a photographic process that was developed in 1842. 1842 was also the year that the last major treaty was signed in Michigan, ceding part of the Western Upper Peninsula. That is the Treaty of La Pointe, and La Pointe signed in La Pointe, Wisconsin. So with this work, the history and understanding the way that photographic processes are also implicated in colonial processes of land ownership and land expropriation is crucial. This platform, which you see hovering above the ground, is also playing with the idea that one of the chiefs in this region from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Shingwak, which means, or Shingwakones, which means little pine, basically was in 1850 signed a treaty and kind of welcomed in my community, the so-called French half-breeds, or the historic rights-bearing Métis communities in Sault Ste. Marie, as well as those from Georgian Bay, and actually petitioned for us to either join his band or to receive and maintain our lands that we're living on at that time. I'm playing here with the notion that is a platform that is old growth pine wood. That's pine root wood that was growing in the Georgian Bay region that then was harvested in the 19th century and went down to the bottom of Lake Huron. I work with an individual who harvests it from the lake and then mills it into the wood. And part of me with this is thinking about the ancestral relationship between this old growth pine and putting it in relationship with new relatives, with new pine. And that's what you can see there with those constellations hanging with new pine needles. They're putting them in relationship. This is part of a series of paintings that are using, basically using the detritus from the processing of tar sands oil. When you take tar sands out of the ground in Alberta and other places to process it into fossil fuels, you get bitumen. And in that I take that bitumen and make paintings from it. So it's this detritus process from land extraction. And then I layer that on top of on top of felt and pine to make these skyscapes. This, for me, these paintings and the ones like this lined in copper are actually about fundamentally as a form of research, articulating the history of colonialism and land extraction here in the Upper Great Lakes. When we look at the merging west of settler colonial regimes and kind of burgeoning colonial capitalist regimes, kind of initially that process happened because of the fur trading, which was about harvesting primarily beaver pelts to be used as felt hats in Europe. So felt becomes important for me. Then it became the deforestation of the lands with the clear cutting for lumber, and more recently, the ongoing expropriation of various minerals from the earth, particularly in the Upper Peninsula, of copper. And so these histories are fundamentally materially linked in ways that these artworks don't just become illustrative of larger stories, but the artworks and the histories and the knowledges that they present are much are in and of themselves a form of knowledge. This work here, which also adds the copper edging to the work, is actually an overhead map of the region of the Kalamazoo River where we saw the oil spill, the largest domestic oil spill a few years ago. And so these works are both speaking back and talking about the ways of putting into contemporary conversations longer histories that don't make the past simply the past, which goes into much larger questions that I'm interested in. Here are some of those smaller cyanotypes. This is what they look like close up. Images of earth, water, sky, which are then rubbed with minerals and dyes and inks and copper and other earth, all rubbed into them. So for me, the objects themselves begin to take on different lives. Here, this old growth is literally put into relationship. These pine needles, which I harvested from the land, and then inserted into this this old growth pine that I worked to have harvested. Above it, you can see these pieces of float copper. If I don't have a full view, but you can see them here again. When you stand back, the float copper, 172 pieces positioned in an array in a celestial sky map, a map of the stars, which would have been viewing the sky from this location at the commencement of the show. So each one of these pieces of copper, when you step back, actually was representative of a star in the sky on that day. These pieces of float copper basically are pieces of copper that were in larger collections of the earth. But as the glacial movements moved across the Upper Great Lakes, they picked up small pieces, which were then moved dozens and hundreds of miles away from the larger copper beds. And so for me, those histories and those movements and those diasporas become crucial to thinking about our larger positionality within systems and our larger understanding of history. I'm going to end with a few more images here and then kind of turn it over to give us some time for conversation. As I've said, much of my research projects and the methodologies I use are about relationship building, are about thinking longer term, longer histories, but they're also about understanding absences and also understanding and bringing forward various other histories. This is a work that recently came down. It was exhibited for 2 years at the Arcus Center for Social Justice Leadership at Kalamazoo College in West Michigan. Kalamazoo College sits on land that was ceded in the Treaty of Chicago. What I did for that show was I engaged in archival and historical research to look at that particular treaty. And when that treaty was signed in Chicago, there was contention within indigenous signatories of the treaty because many leaders of Anishinaabe communities understood the failure by Anglo-America to actually recognize and live up to their end of the treaty. And so a Potawatomi chief gave a well-known oratory, which exists in an English translation, which is easily accessible online and in other sources, but basically gave an oratory against signing of treaties because of this fundamental failure by Americans to actually live up to their end of the bargain. What I did was I took that text and began to pull out poetic fragments and reorder them to think about that history and the fragmentary way that it comes to us, but also thinking about the way that it's up to us as either indigenous or settler or arrivant, as various people who are in relationship to the treaties. It's up to us to understand that these treaties, historic treaties, are not somehow past, but are actually very much alive and very politically and legally relevant today. So each of these fragments comes from that leader's oratory. I combine them with medicinal or edible plants that grow on the territory that the university sits within, or the college sits within, Kalamazoo College. And you can see this is the banners fully installed. So for me, working in as an artist, it's based in a particular ontology, a particular way of being, a particular epistemology, way of knowing that I think is simultaneously embedded for many of us within university systems, embedded in our structures, yet somehow outside of them. Thinking about, this was from a show called The Silence of Sovereignty, thinking about the way that particular settler societies often think of indigenous peoples in particular, but we could also think of this summer, Black resistance movements and the various solidarities that were in alignment with the movement for Black lives. But the way that for mainstream institutions, BIPOC peoples, Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color only become relevant when they're noisy. And so I wanted to think about what happens, how are those silences, what happens, how, can we articulate sovereignty in those silent spaces? And so these are actually Michigan State University marching band bass drum covers that I've installed in various galleries and institutions in differing forms, intimating and discussing the different silences or places of silence. I also think, and this is the last thing, that we can rethink the research that goes into artistic books, artist books, as a form of publishing, that oftentimes we haven't fully understood how artist books, and I'm very interested in the whole system that exists within art book fairs that come out of, say, zine culture and other places, how these particular disciplinary and other forms, literary forms, exist outside of, the academic peer-reviewed system. And I'm going to end with this, asking this question here for our conversation. How do we make more central arts as research? How do we make this more central within the land-grant university? But also, as I've said, how do we remain critical about the history of and the current practices of the land-grant university? So
Thank you very
yeah,
much, Dylan.
yeah.
We will, it's an excellent question to end the presentation with. We will now turn to questions from the audience. And we have one that was posted to the Q&A, so I'll read it. And I don't know if the audience can unmute themselves and ask questions. If you'd prefer to do it that way, you're certainly welcome to. Otherwise, depositing them in the chat or in the Q&A function in the webinar would work just fine, and I can read the questions. Interested in hearing how these art research commitments and practices might shape your pedagogical practice with students and classes. This is from Emery Pechauer.
Great. That's a good question. I think that, you know, for me in particular, I teach in the residential college in the arts and humanities, which is, you know, already an interdisciplinary space, which allows for both curricular and pedagogical exploration. You know, for me, this semester, I'm teaching a course using the risograph which is a certain print form to allow the students to make posters, to make books, and using this to think about contemporary political issues and responding to them. So it's both engaging in historical research, but having the research itself not become manifest in a traditional artistic or in a traditional research project, but actually, you know, begin to understand, is there a way that they can articulate a voice for themselves within the project and within contemporary society in general? And for me, I think the arts, visual arts in particular, offer a certain way of being and a way of knowing that, you know, that just simply writing with text doesn't always allow.
Great. Thank you, Dylan. Please, if you have a question, let me know. Either raise your hand if you want to ask it that way, or put it in the Q&A in the chat. While we're waiting for your questions, I'll ask one. I am. I actually have quite a few, but I'll start with this one. I really like the idea of expanding, or at least what I take to be a kind of expansion of an understanding of methodology out in the ways that you've recommended in your shows and in your art, like the methodology of visiting and the methodology of low writing, among others. I'm especially kind of interested in maybe hearing more about the methodology of visiting. It's one of the things we do in the center is we run dialogue-based workshops, and so we're really focused on trying to create community within relatively short periods of time, possibly with groups of strangers. And so I feel like there might be some affinity between what we're trying to do in some of our work and what you're and this methodology. But that's kind of what's motivating me to be interested in it. But I'd love to learn more about how you practice it and to what end. You like what when you utilize this methodology, how do you know it's been successful?
well, I think that's, you know, potentially one of the pushbacks that has to happen is that, you know, especially when we need to use social science mechanisms to prove some, you know, to prove the efficaciousness of, you know, whatever that thing is. And, you know, as an artist who's engaged in lots of community-based workshops, as well as somebody who employs, you know, the methodology of visiting frequently, I think what becomes difficult is when those practices have to be squared up with the expectations of the university, and particularly expectations of whether it's funders or others who, you know, may have something like where you have to report, but also have to have evidence-based, whatever that is. For me, at least, in the way that I've articulated it and have shared this and engaged in conversations with folks, is this notion of visiting doesn't have as its endpoint something else. And I think that that's what reporting and other mechanisms, have to have, is that visiting, it can be, in and of itself, can be the thing. And the same thing with, my native kids ride bikes. So I've spent years hosting workshops and building lowrider bicycles with youth. On the one hand, they're about building relationships between and amongst the youth, and between the youth and elders and community members, as well as, putting me in that matrix. In some ways, I would say the bikes, which I showed as part of this, which become nice to look at, are actually the detritus. They're the leftover remnants of the artwork itself. The artwork is the actual visiting. And I would say, the same thing is happening in pedagogical spaces, where the outcome isn't necessarily, the tangible research productivity that the university and, many of us operating within it continue to measure. Even when we push back against it, we continue to hold those similar, research measures up. For me, it can, in and of itself, be the thing. And I think that that's where we need to figure out a way, and I haven't figured out a way how to position that within the university, but how to actually, say the visiting is the thing. We don't have to have a measurable come from it. We don't have to then turn that into research, which we then publish. But the visiting in and of itself is fundamentally about itself. And being about itself, that's about so many other things. So yeah.
No, I appreciate that, and I totally own the idea. I actually, we'll come back to that maybe, because I think
this isn't a push, but a critique of you, Michael, or anyone here. And it's I think being part of these mechanisms, trying to understand, are there ways we can transform the system and use something like visiting, while also understanding that there is and has been and likely will into the into the future, there is an annual evaluative process. So how do you
And you mentioned logic before, and I think that's at least way that I can understand. One way to understand this is that there's a sort of logic of methodology, a kind of that carries with it certain implications, and what you're challenging, I think, in part, is that logic, right? So, like, at least as I am interpreting what you're doing in your response. But I have another great question here from Karen Zitzowitz. Hi, Dylan. Great to get this overview of your work. In thinking about art as research, it seems like there are a bunch of issues. I'll just choose one. I think the being-knowing dyad you've posed is spot on, but I wonder also about communication. Since your work engages so much with medium or media, I thought I'd ask how you might want to fit that in. Obviously, visiting is one form among many others.
So, Karin, can you speak at this point? Could you maybe give a little bit more here? Are you able to unmute yourself, or can Michael unmute you?
I might need to do that for her, but I think I just. There
we go.
I think I just did.
Sorry.
I hope I did.
Yes, you did.
Okay, good.
Hey, everybody. So what I meant is, Dylan, is that you're thinking a lot about visiting, which and sort of creating these sort of spaces of community and of commensality, et cetera.
Yep.
But I'm also interested in the way that is different in the same with your work with text, and particularly with print media. And and so it's not, when you're thinking about art as knowledge, obviously knowledge, the communication of knowledge, is separate but connected to the production of knowledge. Yep. And so I wanted to ask you how you thought about communication as part of your work. Does it make sense?
Yes, perfect. Yeah. And I think that you'll probably know it, and if anybody else here has knows my work or has seen my work anywhere, like it's, I don't know if it's odd, but what I did with this talk was I didn't include any of until the kind of publishing work at the end, much of the print work wasn't there. And so for me, I think this is also a tension for me, and also I think a larger tension between art that is intended for a gallery or a museum, which has a certain infrastructures around it, knowledge systems that exist around it, and me trying to push back on those on those discourses and institutions and infrastructure. And the print-based work I make, which is much more agitprop and agitational, which is trying to push back on larger social structures and social inequities, and the understanding of the way that those social inequities are very much, historically based, and how actually understanding those historicities can help us move our present moment and move towards, or at least gesture towards, a more socially just, if not a decolonial and anti-racist present and future. So yeah, getting to notions of communication, I think that this is where, art as a singular category, needs to, I think, be discerned and pulled apart, because what I'm doing and the kind of open-ended communicability of the gallery work and what I was showing today, I think, I don't think it contradicts necessarily, but it does push back, is pushed back a little bit by, like you were saying, the more communicative work, the print-based work that I'm doing, which might be a bit more agitational propaganda, which doesn't have a unidirectional understanding, but pushes thought in a very different way.
I think
thanks. I've
Okay.
been given permission, right, Michael?
You haven't. Yes, you can ask another question.
Okay, I promise to stop after this. But I wanted to go back to what you said about basically annual review. And I mean, I think Michael definitely knows this, and if any of my colleagues are out there, I'm obsessed with this. But for good reasons. I think what's interesting is to think about that problem with the relationship between open-ended and, I guess, closed communication, right? And thinking about the way that these two parts of your work, or parts of most people's work, frankly, they hail different kinds of audiences. And so what it really means is that you need, when thinking about things like peer review, to think about the way that these different forms of communication actually reach different people and produce different kinds of reactions, all of which need to be valued, right? And so the question is, how do you work together to substantiate those forms of value and work them into a system? Does that make sense? So that the forms of community that you're building with the community-based work, and the platform that you're creating with publishing, and then the sort of more open-ended, more interpretive work in galleries, should all be hailing different groups of people, right? And ideally that's better than just sitting with your 5 people who understand exactly what you're doing with you all the time, right? So anyway, I just thought I wanted to bring those together and to see what you guys thought about that idea.
So many things here, Karen. And I think that, I mean, fundamentally you're talking about values, and how do we transform, we're, most people here, I'm guessing, on the conversation are here at Michigan State, because this is a particular moment institutionally of a so-called, moment of values change, top down from the leadership, but also I think horizontally, hopefully as well. How do we engage in a understanding and recognizing value, or transforming what we're thinking about as valuable in an institution that hasn't come to grips with its larger historical trajectory? I think about this frequently, and I think about this in relationship. This might be going a bit aside, Karen, but for me, they're linked up. I think a lot about, can the United States actually, overcome its foundational violences? And can it actually, as a society, can it actually begin to move past those? And, I don't think at this moment it can. And so the question is, can a university, as both a structure in and of itself, but also as a, as a network of humans and non-human actors within it, can we begin to transform what we see as valuable and to recognize that? And this is all, of course, going back to the notion that, as I said, 1862, the Morrill Act, the very impetus for our university is one that's, commencing from, simultaneous colonial violences. And so, move forward 150 plus years, and those are at the core of, of what values an institution has. Of course, not in play, not even beginning to think about the way that capitalism as an economic structure and heteropatriarchy as a gendered structure, how those are implicated in our in our evaluative processes.
Thank you very much, Dylan. And Karin, thank you for your questions. Thanks everyone for attending today. And we are really grateful for your time and invite you to join us again in 3 weeks, not 2, 3 weeks, on the 4th of December for our next University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. Once again, Dylan, this has been fantastic. Really appreciate your time and the preparation you put into getting ready for today. And thank you. Take care, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Dylan.
Can I say one more thing?
Please,
in
please.
particular, I had a show this past spring which shut down because of coronavirus at the Workers' Arts and Heritage Center in Hamilton, Ontario, an old Union town in the Greater Toronto region or just outside. But that show was called "These Conditions Can Be Changed," which as a term comes from the industrial workers of the world, their early 20th century constitution. But going back to much of what I've been saying, I think that as artists and as scholars, I think that we have to be cognizant of the reality that this is kind of also responding to Karin's question, that these conditions can be changed, and we as individuals and as collectivities can in fact be active in changing these conditions.
And I just to follow up on that, I hope that people will go away with that last slide that you presented in mind, right? How can we take art as research and situate it more prominently and more centrally in the life of a land-grant university in particular? I think that's an extraordinarily important thing to be thinking about. And thank you for introducing it. And thanks everyone again for attending.